My name is Marcus Reynolds, and this happened to me in the summer of 1985. I still get chills thinking about those 7 days in Olympic National Forest, Washington. Sometimes, when I look at old family photos, I have to remind myself that it wasn't just a nightmare, it was real. Back then, I was a 35-year-old wildlife photographer, living what I thought was a perfect life. My wife Olivia was a caring veterinarian, and we had beautiful 8-year-old twin daughters, Ruby and Rose. Even our German Shepherd Scout was everything you could want in a family dog. We lived in Seattle, but I was always chasing the next great wildlife shot, dragging my family along in our silver 1975 Airstream Land yacht, our home away from home. That summer, I got a tip about a rare wolf pack in a remote valley of the Olympic Forest. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for both work and family time. The girls were on summer break, Olivia had some vacation days saved up, and I needed those wolf photos for a magazine feature. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs. The twins were born during a full moon, and they'd always been different. Ruby could sense things before they happened, while Rose had this fierce, almost wild personality. But hey, what parent doesn't think their kids are special? If only I'd known what awaited us in those ancient woods. If only I'd paid attention to the warnings. Maybe then our family wouldn't have been torn apart by creatures that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. But I guess I should start at the beginning, when we first arrived at that cursed valley. That's when everything started to change and our normal life turned into something straight out of a horror story. We pulled into the forest campsite late afternoon. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the tall trees. Our Airstream looked tiny compared to the massive pines surrounding us. The air felt different here. Cooler and somehow heavier than usual. "Daddy, something feels weird," Ruby said, holding her sister's hand as they stepped out of the RV. Rose nodded in agreement but stayed quiet, her eyes scanning the tree line. Olivia was setting up our camping area while I checked my camera gear. Scout, usually playful and relaxed, stood stiff-legged at the edge of our campsite, his ears perked forward and a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Scout, what's wrong, boy?" I called out, but he didn't respond, really unusual for him. That's when I noticed the claw marks on the nearest tree. They were way too high, maybe 8 feet up, and deeper than any bear marks I'd ever seen. Something wasn't right. "Hey honey," I called to Olivia, trying to keep my voice casual. "Come take a look at this." As Olivia examined the marks, a park ranger's truck pulled up. The ranger, looking worried, told us another ranger had gone missing 3 weeks ago. They were still searching for him. That night, as we sat in our Airstream, the twins had the same dream. They woke up at exactly the same time, both talking about wolf people watching them from the trees. Scout wouldn't stop pacing and whining at the windows. I tried to tell myself it was just the girl's imagination, that the claw marks were from a really big bear, that Scout was just adjusting to the new place. But deep down, I knew we'd stumbled into something dangerous. The moon was almost full outside, shining bright through the Airstream's windows. As I looked out into the darkness, I could have sworn I saw eyes reflecting back, not at normal animal height, but much, much higher. That was just the first night. If I'd known what the next few days would bring, I would have packed up right then and driven as far away as possible. But I didn't, and that mistake would cost us dearly. The next morning, I woke up early to photograph the sunrise. Scout refused to leave the RV. He just stood at the door, hackles raised, and wouldn't budge. That wasn't like him at all. "Marcus," Olivia called from outside. "You need to see this." I grabbed my camera and hurried out. There, in the soft dirt near our campsite, were footprints. But these weren't normal wolf prints, they were huge, easily twice the size they should be. And something else was weird about them, they looked almost human-like. While I was taking pictures of the prints, the twins came outside. They were holding hands again, something they'd been doing more often since we arrived. "They're watching us," Ruby whispered. "Who's watching us, sweetie?" Olivia asked, kneeling beside them. "The others," Rose answered, staring into the forest. "They're waiting for the full moon." That afternoon we found the abandoned ranger station. The door was hanging off its hinges, And inside was worse. Papers were scattered everywhere, furniture was overturned, and there were deep claw marks on the walls. But what really scared me was the dried blood we found on the floor. As we were leaving the station, we heard it, a howl that made my skin crawl. It started like a wolf's cry but ended sounding almost human. Scout started barking frantically back at the RV. "We should go," Olivia said, grabbing my arm. "Marcus, this isn't right." But before we could move, the twins spoke at the same time. "They won't let us leave now. We belong to the pack." The way they said it, in perfect unison, with voices that didn't sound quite like their own, I felt real fear then. Not the kind you get from watching scary movies, but deep, primal fear. That night, as we huddled in the Airstream, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. In one of them, taken toward the tree line, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of glowing eyes, about 7 feet off the ground, and the outline of what looked like a person, but not quite a person. The twins were getting stranger by the hour. They would stare out the windows and whisper to each other in words we couldn't understand. And outside, in the darkness, we could hear heavy footsteps circling our RV, getting closer and closer. The third day changed everything. It was just before sunset when I finally saw them. I was setting up my camera near the RV when the air suddenly got ice cold. Scout started barking like crazy, and then, I saw it. Standing between two trees was something that looked like a wolf, but it was walking on 2 legs. It was huge, maybe 7 feet tall, with dark fur and eyes that glowed yellow in the fading light. When it moved, it seemed to pass right through the branches like they weren't even there. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature just stared at me, and in my head, I heard words that weren't spoken. "The Moon Children belong with us. Marcus, get inside, now," Olivia screamed from the RV door. I ran back, my hands shaking so bad I could barely climb the steps. Inside, the twins were sitting on their bed, holding hands and swaying back and forth. They were speaking in perfect unison again, talking about the pack and the calling. That night was worse. More of them came. We could see their shadows moving around the RV, some walking upright, others on all fours. Scout was going crazy, barking and growling at every window. I tried taking more photos through the windows. When I looked at them on my camera, all I could see were those glowing eyes and dark shapes that seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. "They're getting stronger," Ruby said, her voice sounding distant. "The full moon is coming." Rose added, "They want us to join them, Ruby. They say we're like them." Olivia held the girls close, trying to comfort them, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Our daughters were changing somehow. When they thought we weren't looking, they would stare out the windows and make soft growling sounds that no human child should be able to make. Around midnight, Scout suddenly stopped barking. He walked to the RV door and sat there, staring at it like he was waiting for something. Then he started howling, not his normal howl, but something that sounded almost like the creatures outside. The temperature inside the RV kept dropping. We could see our breath in the air, and frost was forming on the windows. Through the ice patterns, I swear I could see faces, wolf faces watching us. None of us slept that night. How could we, when we knew those things were out there, getting closer, waiting for something? And deep down, I was starting to realize that maybe what they were waiting for was our daughters. The 4th day started with Scout disappearing. One minute he was there, the next he was gone. We searched around the RV, calling his name, but deep down I knew something was wrong. When he came back hours later, he wasn't the same dog. His eyes had a yellowish glow, and he wouldn't come near us. He just sat at the edge of our campsite, staring into the forest like he was guarding something or waiting for something. While searching for Scout earlier, Olivia had found something disturbing, an old Native American warning carved into a tree. She'd taken a photo of it and was researching on her small laptop we'd brought along. "Marcus," she whispered, not wanting the twins to hear, These markings, they're warnings about moon children's kids, born under a full moon. They say these children belong to the forest spirits. My heart sank. Ruby and Rose were born during a full moon. The creatures were getting bolder. They'd come right up to the RV now, their massive shadows blocking out what little sunlight filtered through the trees. The twins would press their hands against the windows when they appeared, like they were trying to reach out to them. That night, something knocked on our RV door. 3 slow, heavy knocks that made the whole vehicle shake. Then we heard a voice. Not with our ears, but in our heads. The moon children must return to their true family. Ruby's eyes lit up at the words, but Rose grabbed her sister's hand, looking scared. "I want to stay, Ruby," Rose whispered. "Don't listen to them." "But they're calling us," Ruby replied, her voice different, almost growling. "Can't you feel it?" I found something in my camera bag that made everything worse. Newspaper clippings I'd collected while researching the area. Stories about missing children over the years, all of them twins, all of them born under full moons. The temperature dropped again, and this time the frost on our windows formed clear pictures. Wolves running, children dancing, and something that looked half human, half wolf watching over them all. Outside, Scout started howling again. But this time dozens of other howls answered back. The sound was getting closer, and the twins were starting to howl too. We had one more day until the full moon, and I was terrified of what would happen when it finally rose. The 5th day was when everything started falling apart. The twins were barely speaking English anymore, just making these strange growling sounds to each other. Ruby's eyes had started to change, getting that same yellow glow we'd seen in the creatures. Rose fought against it more, clinging to Olivia and crying that her sister was going away. Then the pack leader showed itself. It was taller than the others, with silver-gray fur and eyes that looked ancient and intelligent. It stood right in front of our RV in broad daylight, and its voice filled all our heads. "Your daughters were never truly yours. They belong to the moon, to the pack. Fighting us will only bring pain." I grabbed my camera, thinking if I could just get proof of all this, maybe we could get help. But when I looked through the viewfinder, the creature wasn't there. In its place was just a shadow shaped like a wolf. Olivia, being a vet, had an idea. She'd brought some silver nitrate for treating animals. In all the old stories, she whispered to me, silver hurts werewolves. Maybe. We didn't get to finish that conversation because Ruby suddenly screamed. Her fingers were starting to change, nails turning into claws. Rose ran to her sister, but when they touched, both girls fell to the floor, shaking. "I can feel them in my head, Daddy," Rose cried. "They're showing us things, other children who joined them. They're happy there, but they're not human anymore." Outside, Scout sat with the creatures now, like he was part of their pack. The forest itself seemed to be changing. The trees looked like they were moving closer, making our little clearing smaller and smaller. That night, we heard children laughing in the woods. Lots of children. Ruby pressed her face against the window, smiling. "They're all like us," she said. "All born under the full moon, all waiting for so long to be found." But Rose shook her head. "They're not like us anymore, Ruby. They've forgotten who they were." The pack leader's voice came again. "Tomorrow night when the moon is full, you must choose. Fight us and lose both children, or let nature take its course. One may stay, one may go, but the choice must be made." Olivia worked through the night, mixing her silver nitrate into something we could use to defend ourselves. But as I watched her work, I couldn't help wondering, how do you fight something that can walk through walls? How do you protect your children from what they might really be? The last thing I saw before the sun rose was Ruby and Rose's reflection in the window. For a moment, just a moment, they didn't look human at all. The final night came with the full moon rising huge and bright over the forest. Everything seemed to glow with a strange silvery light. The air felt electric, like just before a storm. Ruby was almost gone by then. Her eyes fully yellow, her voice a growl. Rose held onto her human side, but we could see her fighting something inside her. The twins kept trying to open the RV door, so we had to tie them to their beds. It broke our hearts to do it. Around midnight, the pack attacked. They came from all sides, their massive bodies slamming against our airstream. The windows frosted over instantly, and through the ice, we could see dozens of glowing eyes. The whole RV rocked back and forth. Scout burst through the door. First, Miters, but not our loving family dog anymore. He was bigger now, his fur darker, his eyes glowing like the others. But when the pack tried to come in after him, he turned and fought them instead of us. He was still protecting his family even after changing. The moon calls them. The pack leader's voice boomed in our heads. You cannot stop what they are becoming. Ruby broke free first, her ropes snapping like thread. She ran to the door, but Rose screamed, "Ruby, no, stay with us." I tried to grab Ruby, but she was too strong now. Her hands had turned into claws, and she scratched my chest deep when I reached for her. Olivia threw her silver nitrate mixture at the creatures coming through the door. They howled in pain when it hit them, their fur smoking where the liquid touched. But there were too many. They kept coming, walking right through the walls now. Scout fought like a demon, taking down 3 of them before a larger one caught him in its jaws. The sound he made, I'll never forget it. Choose now, the pack leader commanded. One stays, one goes, or lose both forever. Ruby was already halfway transformed, looking more wolf than human. But Rose was crying, still fighting it. She grabbed her sister's hand one last time. I'm staying, Ruby, she said. But I'll never forget you. Everything happened so fast after that. The creatures smashed through our RV like it was made of paper. Ruby ran to them willingly, changing completely as she did. Rose screamed as partial transformation tore through her body, but she fought it back. I tried to stop them from taking Ruby, and that's when one of them slashed me across my back. I still have the scars. Olivia threw the last of the silver nitrate, giving Rose enough time to run to us, and then, just like that, they were gone. Ruby with them. The forest went silent except for a single howl in the distance, a howl that sounded like our daughter saying goodbye. When dawn finally came, we stood in what was left of our campsite. Our airstream was destroyed, claw marks everywhere, windows shattered, everything inside torn apart. Scout's body was gone, like he'd never existed at all. The only proof of what happened were my wounds and the deep claw marks in the trees. Rose was different after that night. She stayed human mostly, but sometimes when she's upset, her eyes get that yellow glow. Every full moon she gets restless and we can hear her softly howling in her sleep. She never completely changed like Ruby did, but she's not fully human anymore either. The police searched for Ruby, of course. They found nothing, no footprints, no trace of the creatures, not even the ranger station looked damaged anymore. It was like everything had been erased. The only evidence I had were my photos, but when I developed them, they showed nothing but shadows and blurred shapes. Sometimes, on full moon nights, we hear howling in the distance. Not normal wolf howls. These sound different, almost like children laughing
mixed with wolf cries.
Rose says she can hear Ruby's voice among them, calling to her. But she stays with us, fighting what's inside her every month. We moved away from Washington after that. Couldn't bear to stay near those woods. But every year around the time Ruby was taken, we get a strange package. Inside we find things like a lock of dark fur, small animal bones arranged in patterns, or weird drawings that look like they were made with claws. We never see who delivers them, but we know
they're from Ruby.
Olivia still works as a vet, but she can't treat wolves anymore. I gave up wildlife photography. Some things you just can't go back to after what we saw. Rose is 18 now. She's learned to control her changes. But sometimes when she thinks we're not looking, she stares at the moon with such longing. I know she misses her sister. Twins share a bond that even supernatural forces can't completely break. I'm telling this story now because people need to know. If you're ever in those woods, and you hear children laughing mixed with wolf howls, run. And if you're expecting twins, pray they're not born under a full moon. Because sometimes the things we think are just stories, just legends, they're real. And they're waiting in the dark, watching for children born under the full moon, waiting to take them back to where they think they belong. Ruby, if you're somehow reading this, we still love you, and we miss you every day. Rose keeps your picture by her bed, and every full moon, she howls back to you, just to let you know she hasn't forgotten her sister. Some nights, I think I can still hear Scout barking in the distance, still trying to protect both sides of his divided family. My name is Amy Harrison, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1978, when I was just 11 years old. Back then, I was just a normal kid who loved collecting rocks and following my big brother Peter around with his camera. We lived in Boston, and that summer was supposed to be special, our first real family vacation in years. Dad, who everyone called David, was a carpenter who used to be in the Vietnam War. He had these sad, distant looks sometimes, and Mom, that's Catherine, thought a camping trip might help him feel better. She was a high school teacher, always trying to fix everything with careful plans and warm smiles. Peter was 14 and thought he was so grown up with his new camera. He was always taking pictures of everything, saying he'd be a famous photographer someday. I remember how he used to tease me about my rock collection, but he'd still help me look for interesting ones whenever we went somewhere new. We had this old forest green Winnebago Brave, kind of rusty, but Dad said it had character. I can still remember how excited we all were when we packed it up that morning. Mom made her special sandwiches, Peter kept taking pictures of everything, and I carefully packed my rock collection in my favorite shoebox. None of us knew that this would be our last trip together. None of us could have guessed that my innocent hobby of collecting rocks would lead to finding that strange carved stone, or that our family camping trip would turn into something from our worst nightmares. I've never told this story before. For years I couldn't even talk about it. But now, I think people need to know what really happened in the White Mountains that summer, about the hunger that changed my family, about the things that live in those ancient forests, about why sometimes when it gets really cold even in summer you should pack up and run as fast as you can. This is my story. And I warn you, once you hear it, you might never look at family camping trips the same way again. Everything seemed normal that first day. We drove for hours with Mom pointing out pretty views and Dad quietly humming along to the radio. Peter kept complaining about how his camera kept fogging up even though it was summer. I remember thinking that was weird. We found this quiet spot off an old logging trail to park our Winnebago. The trees were so tall they seemed to touch the sky, and the forest was thicker than any I'd seen before. While Mom and Dad set up camp, I went looking for rocks. I always did that back then. That's when I found it. This strange stone with weird markings on it. It felt cold even in the warm sun, but something made me want to keep it. That first night, things started feeling different. We had just finished eating Mom's spaghetti in the RV when we heard it, this scratching sound outside. It wasn't like animals we'd heard before. It was slower, more deliberate, like someone dragging their nails across the RV's metal walls. Probably just branches, Dad said, but I saw how he sat up straighter, his eyes getting that faraway look they sometimes got when he remembered the war. When we stopped for gas earlier, this old man working there tried to warn us. His hands were shaking as he filled our tank. Folks shouldn't be camping up there now, he'd said. It's hungry season. Mom had laughed it off, but now, listening to those scratches in the dark, his words kept repeating in my head. Peter was acting strange too. He kept staring out the window, taking pictures of the darkness. "There's something out there," he whispered. "I can feel it watching us." That night I slept with my new carved stone under my pillow. The scratching continued until dawn, and the temperature dropped so low we could see our breath, in the middle of July. Looking back now, I wish we'd listened to that gas station man. I wish we'd turned around right then. But we didn't know. We couldn't have known what was coming for us. The hungry season was just beginning. The next morning everything felt wrong. Dad was the first to notice the footprints around our RV. They were huge, bigger than any animal prints I'd ever seen. When I put my foot next to one, it was 3 times the size of my shoe. Dad's face went pale when he saw them. "Those weren't here last night," he said quietly, looking around like he used to in his war stories. But the footprints weren't even the scariest part. We found dead animals, rabbits and squirrels, laid out in perfect circles near our campsite. It wasn't natural. Animals don't die in patterns. Peter was acting weird. He kept taking pictures, but when we looked at them later, there were these dark shadows in the photos that we hadn't seen with our own eyes. Tall, skinny shadows that seemed to be standing between the trees. "I'm so hungry," Peter kept saying, even though he'd just eaten 2 sandwiches. Mom tried to give him more food, but nothing seemed to satisfy him. The air got colder and colder. Our breath came out like smoke and frost started forming on the RV windows. In the middle of summer, I heard Mom and Dad whispering about leaving, but something seemed to be stopping them, like we were being held there by something we couldn't see. That night I had a dream about what I started calling the Hungry Man. He was tall, so tall he bent down to look in our RV windows. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, and he had these huge antlers growing from his head. In my dream he smiled at me with teeth that looked like icicles. When I woke up crying, I found Mom sitting at the RV table, staring out the window. She jumped when I touched her arm. "Amy," she whispered, "have you been hearing it too? The voice that sounds like Dad calling us to come outside." I hadn't, but that made my stomach feel sick, because if Mom was hearing things, and Peter was acting strange and those shadows kept showing up in the photos, I clutched my carved stone tighter. It was ice cold now, and sometimes when no one was looking I could swear I saw the strange marks on it glowing. Something was hunting us, and we were running out of time to escape. The 3rd day was when everything got really bad. We woke up to find all our food gone. Every single bit of it, even the cans were torn open and empty. Mom said maybe it was bears, but Dad shook his head. Bears don't open cans neatly and leave them stacked. Peter was getting scarier by the hour. His eyes looked different, hungry, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. He kept licking his lips and staring at us when he thought we weren't looking. Once I caught him chewing on raw bacon he'd hidden in his pocket. When I told Mom, she just hugged herself and whispered, "Something's wrong with my boy." Dad was the only one who seemed to understand how much danger we were in. I heard him tell Mom, "This is just like Nam. We're being hunted." He started setting up ropes with bells around our campsite just like he did in the war. That afternoon we found something that made Mom cry. There was another campsite hidden behind some trees. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, clothes everywhere, tent torn apart. And there were pieces of things I don't want to talk about. Dad covered my eyes, but I'd already seen the half-eaten camping boots with something still in them. "We have to leave," Dad said, but when we tried to start the RV it just made this horrible grinding noise. We were stuck. That's when Mom started acting weird too. She kept saying she was hungry, but not for regular food. I saw her looking at her own arm once like she was wondering what it tasted like. Dad noticed too, because he started keeping a close eye on her. The carved stone in my pocket was now so cold it burned to touch, but I couldn't let it go. Somehow I knew it was important. When I held it up to the light I could make out a word carved in it: Wendigo. That night Mom tried to bite me. Just reached out suddenly while we were sitting in the RV, her eyes all cloudy and strange. Dad had to lock her in the bathroom. I could hear her scratching at the door, making these horrible hungry noises. "It's okay, Amy," Dad said, holding me while I cried. "We'll figure this out." But I could tell by his voice that he was scared too. And Peter was sitting in the corner smiling with teeth that looked sharper than they should be. I knew then that whatever was out there in the dark wasn't just hunting us anymore. It was turning my family into something else. Something hungry. Peter disappeared just after midnight. 1 minute he was there huddled in his corner and the next, gone. The RV door was wide open, swinging in the icy wind. Dad grabbed his flashlight and went looking for him, telling me to stay inside and keep the door locked. I sat there shaking, listening to Mom scratching and mumbling from the bathroom. The scratching didn't even sound human anymore. That's when I remembered Peter's camera. With trembling hands, I picked it up and looked through his latest pictures. I wish I hadn't. The last photo showed something that made my heart stop. Behind our RV stood this massive figure, at least 12 feet tall. It was skinny, so skinny you could see every bone, with huge antlers growing from its head. Its eyes glowed like ice at the camera flash. But the worst part? Peter was standing right next to it, reaching up to hold its hand, smiling with a mouth full of sharp teeth. Dad came back an hour later, his face white as snow. I found his footprints, he said quietly. They started normal, but then they changed. Started looking like those big ones we saw before. I showed him the camera. His hands shook as he looked at the picture. "Dad," I whispered, holding up my carved stone, "I think I know what's happening." The stone was glowing now. The word Wendigo's burning bright like a tiny blue flame. My teacher told us about Native American legends once. The Wendigo is a spirit that makes people so hungry they want to eat. I couldn't finish, but Dad understood. He hugged me tight and said, "That's why it's called the hungry season." The gas station man tried to warn us. A scream came from outside. Mom's voice, but wrong somehow, like it was mixed with an animal's howl. The bathroom door was broken open, the whole back of the RV covered in deep scratch marks. "Catherine?" Dad called out softly. Her answer came from the darkness outside. "I'm so hungry, David. So hungry. Bring Amy out. Just a little bite. Just a taste." Dad pushed me behind him as something moved in the shadows. Mom stepped into the flashlight beam, but she wasn't Mom anymore. Her eyes were white as ice. Her fingers had grown into long claws, and her mouth was full of jagged icicle teeth. Behind her, in the darkness, I saw more shapes moving. One of them looked like Peter, but too tall now, his neck too long, antlers just beginning to sprout from his head. And behind them all stood the real Wendigo, watching us with its ancient, hungry eyes. Dad grabbed his bag of tools and locked the RV door. "Amy," he said, his voice steady like when he used to tell me everything would be okay, "we're going to have to fight." The temperature dropped so low that ice started forming on the inside of the windows. Outside, the things that used to be my mother and brother began tapping on the glass, calling my name in sing-song voices. The hungry season had come for my family, and I was next. Everything happened so fast after that. Dad started moving like he was back in the war, setting up traps around the RV with his tools and ropes. He kept whispering to himself, counting bullets in his old hunting rifle. "The cold," he said, "it's not natural. The thing out there, it's making it." Ice was creeping up the walls now, and I could see my breath in the air. The RV felt like a freezer. Then the voices started. First Mom, then Peter, then voices I didn't know, all calling, begging to be let in. They sounded so hungry, so desperate. Sometimes they sounded like they were crying, and it broke my heart not to open the door. "Don't listen," Dad warned. "That's not them anymore." The carved stone in my hand was glowing brighter now, warming up instead of being ice cold. Somehow, I knew it was protecting me. When I held it up, the voices seemed to get quieter. Suddenly there was a huge crash. The RV's front window shattered. Mom, or what used to be Mom, was halfway through, her body all twisted and wrong. Her skin was gray like ice, and those terrible teeth were snapping at us. Dad fired the rifle, but the bullets just seemed to go right through her. She laughed, this horrible screeching laugh that made my ears hurt. Then we saw it, the real Wendigo. It was hunched over our RV, its massive antlers scraping the roof. It was so tall, so skinny, like a skeleton wrapped in gray skin. Its eyes were white and empty, but somehow, they were hungry too. Everything about it was hungry. Peter was there too, almost fully changed now. He didn't even look human anymore. Both of them were trying to get in, their long claws tearing at the RV's walls. "Amy," Dad said, looking at my glowing stone, "that's our only chance. It's been fighting the Wendigo's power this whole time." He grabbed his tool belt and handed me the RV keys. "When I say run, you run. Get to the driver's seat. I'll hold them off. But Dad, I love you, sweetheart." He kissed my forehead. Sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them go. Then he did something I'll never forget. He threw open the RV door and ran outside, yelling and firing his rifle, drawing them away from me. I saw Mom and Peter turn to chase him. The Wendigo raised its horrible head and roared, a sound like winter storms and starvation. Through my tears, I could see Dad leading them away, deeper into the dark forest. That was the last time I ever saw him. The carved stone burned hot in my hand, and I knew what I had to do. I ran to the driver's seat, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the keys. Dad had taught me the basics of driving last summer, just in case, he'd said. Now I knew why. Sometimes parents just know things. The engine sputtered and died twice before roaring to life. Outside, I could hear screaming, horrible screams that didn't sound human anymore. An ice storm was forming around the RV, with snow and hail hitting the windows so hard I thought they might break. That's when I saw them in the rearview mirror. Mom, Peter, and the Wendigo were coming back, running on all fours like animals. Their bodies moved in ways that bodies shouldn't move. Behind them there was no sign of Dad. My stone was burning hot now, glowing so bright it lit up the whole RV. I remembered Dad's last words about driving, when in doubt, just go straight and don't stop. So that's what I did. I pressed the gas pedal all the way down and held the steering wheel tight. The RV shot forward down the logging trail, branches scraping against the sides. I could hear them chasing me, their feet pounding on the ground, getting closer and closer. The ice storm got worse. I could barely see through the windshield. The wipers were frozen solid, and ice covered everything except where my stone's light touched. But somehow, I kept going. Mom's voice came from right outside my window. "Amy, stop. I'm so hungry." Peter was on the other side. "Just a little bite, sis. Just a taste." The Wendigo's claws scraped across the roof, trying to tear it open. But I just gripped the steering wheel harder and kept driving. I drove for what felt like hours through the storm, through the darkness, through their screams and howls. The stone kept glowing, keeping the worst of the ice away. Finally, I saw a sign through the snow, leaving New Hampshire. As soon as I crossed the state line, the screaming stopped. The ice storm vanished like it had never been there. In my rearview mirror, I saw 3 shapes standing at the border, 2 smaller ones and 1 huge one with antlers. They couldn't follow me anymore, but something else followed me instead. Ever since that night, I've felt it, this tiny hunger that never quite goes away. The carved stone still glows sometimes, warning me, keeping the hunger in check. I'm 58 now, but I've never gone camping again. I've never told this story until today. But people need to know about the hungry season, about what lives in those mountains. Sometimes at night, I still hear them calling. And sometimes when it gets cold in the middle of summer, I check my teeth in the mirror, just to make sure they haven't gotten any sharper. Because the hunger, it's patient, it can wait. And I know, somewhere in those mountains, my family is still waiting too. My name is Frederick Miller, but everyone calls me Fred. What I'm about to tell you happened back in 1963, and believe me, not a day goes by when I don't think about it. I was 45 then, a former Navy deep-sea diver, living a quiet life with my wife Eleanor and our grandson Timothy. Timothy came to live with us 6 months before this story begins, after my daughter Judy, his mother, disappeared without a trace. The poor boy hadn't spoken a word since that day. He would just sit there, drawing in his notebook, his blue eyes carrying a sadness no 9-year-old should have to bear. Eleanor, my wife, worked at the local library and had always been fascinated by old stories and legends. When we started hearing about strange lights over the lakes in northern Minnesota's Boundary Waters, she thought a camping trip might help Timothy heal. We had this old 1960 Volkswagen Westfalia camper, powder blue in color, that we'd taken on countless family trips before. Fresh air and nature, Eleanor said, that's what the boy needs. I wasn't so sure about taking our last camping trip of the season in late September. It was already getting unusually cold, but I agreed. After all, we'd be the last campers out there, and some peaceful time away from town might do us all some good. Little did I know that this decision would lead us to discover the truth about Judy's disappearance and pull us into a world I never believed could exist, even after all my years diving in the Navy's deepest missions. This is our story, a story about family, loss, and the ancient secrets hiding in the depths of Minnesota's remote lakes. Some might find it hard to believe, but I swear every word is true, and it all began on that chilly September morning when we packed up our blue Westfalia and headed north toward the lakes that would change our lives forever. The drive north was quiet, except for the familiar rumble of our old Westfalia's engine. Eleanor sat beside me, flipping through her books about local legends, while Timothy stayed in the back, drawing as usual. The forests got thicker as we drove, and the roads became more winding. We arrived at the Boundary Waters just before sunset. The lake was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the orange sky above. As I parked our camper near the water's edge, something felt different. The air was colder than it should have been, and there wasn't a single bird singing. "Fred," Eleanor whispered, pointing to the shore. "Look at that." There, arranged in a perfect circle on the beach, were 7 fish, not scattered like they'd washed up, but placed carefully, as if someone, or something, had put them there on purpose. I'd seen a lot of strange things during my Navy days, but this made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Must be other campers playing tricks," I said, not believing my own words. We hadn't seen another soul for miles. That first night, we tried to keep things normal. Eleanor cooked dinner on our little stove, and I set up Timothy's sleeping bag. But as darkness fell, we heard it. A strange haunting sound coming from the lake. It reminded me of the whale songs I'd heard during my deep-sea missions, but this was different. This sound seemed to be calling to us. Timothy, who hadn't shown much reaction to anything in months, suddenly pressed his face against the camper's window, staring at the dark water. In his hand, his pencil moved quickly across his notebook. I glanced at his drawing. It showed dark shapes moving under the water's surface. Before going to bed, I filled our water bottles from our filtered supply, but when I took a sip, the water tasted brackish, like seawater. That was impossible. We were hundreds of miles from the ocean. "We should leave," Eleanor said softly, looking at her books with worried eyes. "The local legends, they warn about the water people. I thought they were just stories, but I assured her everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew we'd stumbled into something beyond our understanding. As we tried to sleep that night, I heard soft splashing outside, and what sounded like wet footsteps approaching our camper. When I looked out the window, I saw nothing, just a trail of water leading from the lake to our door, glistening in the moonlight. Timothy finally fell asleep, clutching his notebook, but Eleanor and I stayed awake, listening to the strange songs from the lake grow louder as the night went on. Something was out there in the water, watching us, and somehow, I felt it had been waiting for us all along. The next morning, things got stranger. While making breakfast, Eleanor called me over to the shore. She'd found something carved into the rocks, old drawings that looked like they'd been there for hundreds of years. They showed tall, fish-like creatures standing with normal people. Some of the people in the drawings were being led into the water, never to return. "Fred," Eleanor's voice shook. "These markings, they're exactly like what Timothy's been drawing." Speaking of Timothy, he was acting different. For the first time in months, he seemed almost excited, constantly looking at the water. But it wasn't a happy kind of excitement, more like he was in a trance. That afternoon, I caught him walking toward the lake 3 times. As if something was calling him. I decided to check my old diving equipment, thinking I might need to take a look under the water. But when I opened the storage compartment, everything was soaking wet and rearranged. My oxygen tanks, which I always kept in the back, were now in front. The weird thing was, the compartment had been locked the whole time. That night, things got worse. The water around our camper started rising, even though there hadn't been any rain. It wasn't natural. I'd spent enough time at sea to know when water wasn't behaving like it should. Look, Eleanor pointed out the window around midnight. There were lights under the water, moving in patterns. They weren't reflections, they were too deep and too organized. They reminded me of the lights I'd seen during my deepest Navy dives, the ones I'd never reported because nobody would have believed me. But the scariest part came when I went to check on Timothy. His bed was empty. I found him outside, standing ankle-deep in the water, staring at something in the distance. When I carried him back, he was ice-cold and whispered one word in his sleep, the first word he'd spoken in 6 months, "Mommy." That's when I noticed something half buried in the sand, near where Timothy had been standing. It was a notebook, its pages wrinkled and water-stained. My hands trembled as I picked it up, because I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Judy's journal. The last entry was dated the day she disappeared, and what I read made my blood run cold. "They're calling me again. I can't resist anymore. I understand now, it's in our blood. It always has been. I'm sorry, Timothy, but one day you'll understand too." Eleanor and I stayed up all night, reading the journal by flashlight, as the strange singing from the lake grew louder and louder. We were finally starting to understand what we were dealing with, but this understanding only made us more terrified, because now we knew they weren't just after anyone, they were after Timothy. Judy's journal revealed the terrifying truth. The water people weren't just stories, they were real. They lived in an ancient city deep under the lakes, and every generation, they chose one person to join them. They had chosen Judy, and now they wanted Timothy. As I read more, memories from my Navy days came flooding back. Those strange shapes I'd seen in the deepest waters, the ones I'd convinced myself were just tricks of the light, they had been real. They were the water people. Eleanor found more in her books. "Fred," she said, her voice trembling, "these beings can create water from nothing. They control the cold, and during the full moon they can walk on land." She paused, looking at the calendar. "Tonight is the full moon." The day passed too quickly. By sunset, a thick fog had rolled in, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The water around our camper kept rising, and now we could feel the vehicle starting to sink, like quicksand was pulling us down. That's when we saw her. Through the fog, a figure emerged from the lake. It looked like Judy, but different. Her skin had a bluish tint, and her eyes seemed to glow in the dark. When she moved, it was like she was floating. Behind her, more figures rose from the water people. "Timothy." Judy's voice was like music, but not quite human anymore. "It's time to come home." Timothy walked toward the door, as if in a trance. I grabbed him, but he was ice cold to the touch. "He belongs with us," Judy said, "just like I do. Our underwater city needs new blood to survive. It's been this way for thousands of years." Eleanor stepped forward, her folklore books clutched to her chest. "Wait," she said. "The ancient stories speak of negotiations, of compromises." The water people moved closer. Our camper was sinking faster now. I had to make an impossible choice, try to save Timothy, and possibly lose him forever, or find another way. That's when Eleanor found something in her books that changed everything. Something about our family's past that even I didn't know. Eleanor's hands were shaking as she read from her book. "Fred, your family. Your grandmother wasn't lost at sea like everyone thought. She was chosen by them. That's why they want Timothy. This connection has been in your blood for generations." Just then, the biggest storm I'd ever seen hit us. The wind howled, and waves crashed against our sinking camper. Timothy started crying, torn between his mother in the water and us. "Please," I called out to Judy, my voice breaking. "He's just a boy." Judy's new strange eyes softened. Dad, I'm happy here. I've found peace in their world. But they're willing to make a deal. The water people moved in a circle around our camper, their singing growing stronger. Through Judy, they made their offer. Timothy could stay with us, but we had to promise to bring him to the lake during every full moon. He would learn about both worlds until he was old enough to choose for himself. And, Judy added, you can visit me, all of you. They'll show you our city under the lake. For the first time in 6 months, Timothy spoke a full sentence. Can we really see where Mommy lives? Eleanor squeezed my hand. It's better than losing him completely, she whispered. I looked at my transformed daughter, my grandson, and my wife. Sometimes love means accepting things we don't understand. We agree, I said. The storm calmed instantly. The water people helped pull our camper to solid ground. Before Judy returned to the lake, she hugged Timothy, leaving behind a trail of glowing water drops. That night changed everything. Our old blue Westphalia became known as the Lake Keeper's Camper. We kept it parked by the shore, a bridge between two worlds. Every full moon we'd return, and Timothy would learn about his underwater family while staying with us on land. Eleanor started writing a new book about the water people with their permission. Timothy began speaking again, and his drawings now showed both his worlds, the one above the water and the one below. As for me, I finally understood all those strange things I'd seen in my Navy days. Sometimes the most unbelievable stories are true. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a new beginning. Our family was different now, split between land and water, but we were still a family. And every full moon, when the lake glows with underwater lights and strange songs fill the air, we remember that love can bridge even the deepest waters. That was 15 years ago. Timothy is grown up now, 24 years old, and he made his choice last summer. He decided to stay on land, but keeps his special connection to the water people. He became a marine biologist, using what he learned from both worlds to help protect our lakes and oceans. Our powder blue Westphalia is still there by the lake, though it's a bit rusty now. We turned it into a small museum of sorts, where Eleanor shares carefully chosen parts of our story with visitors. Most think they're just local legends, but some, the ones who look at the lake with knowing eyes, they understand the truth. Judy visits us more often these days. While she can't stay on land for long, she comes up during every full moon. It's strange seeing my daughter with her bluish skin and glowing eyes, but her laugh is still the same. She tells us amazing stories about the underwater city, with its glowing buildings and mysterious creatures. Last week, something incredible happened. A young girl went missing near the lake, and people were scared. But I knew what had happened. Another family had been chosen. I found her parents and shared our story. Now they're learning to build their own bridge between the two worlds, just like we did. Sometimes at night, when the moon is full and the lake is calm, I sit in our old Westphalia and remember everything that happened. I can hear the water people singing their strange songs, and occasionally, I catch glimpses of lights moving deep under the water. Timothy says they're just saying hello. Eleanor still researches water legends from around the world, and we've learned we're not the only family with ties to the water people. There are others like us, keeping these secrets, protecting these ancient beings who live in the deep. You might wonder why I'm sharing this story now. Well, if you ever find yourself near a lake and hear something that sounds like whale song, or see lights moving under the water, or find fish arranged in perfect circles on the shore, don't be afraid. Sometimes what seems scary at first can turn out to be something beautiful. Sometimes the strangest parts of our lives become the most precious. The water people taught us that family doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Love can flow like water, finding its way through any gap, connecting different worlds. And if you ever visit the Boundary Waters and see an old powder blue Volkswagen Westphalia parked near the shore, stop by. Eleanor and I might be there, and we might just tell you more about the mysteries hiding beneath the ancient waters. The second day started with an argument. Lucas was determined to investigate one of the old mine shafts, showing me strange markings he'd found on his mining maps. I didn't want him anywhere near those holes, but you know how teenagers are. The more you say no, the more they want to do something. "There's something down there, Dad," he insisted, spreading the maps on our fold-out RV table. "Look at these symbols. They're not like regular mining marks. And these tunnels, they're older than the coal mining operations." Maria studied the maps with her professor's eye. "He's right, Jack. These markings are different. And look at these mineral samples I collected yesterday." She showed us some strange glowing rocks she'd found. I've never seen anything like them in all my years of studying geology. That's when we heard a scream, not a human scream. Something else. It echoed through the valley, making Charlie bark like crazy. We rushed outside and found another dead animal, this time a large fox. Like the deer, it had those same surgical-like cuts, but now we noticed something else. Its bones seemed bent in impossible ways, like they'd been twisted by something incredibly strong. "We should call someone," I said, reaching for my phone. No signal. Of course, Lucas was recording everything with his phone, getting excited about each new discovery. But I noticed something he didn't. That's fresh claw marks on the ground, leading toward the largest mine entrance. They weren't from any animal I knew, and I'd seen plenty in my mining days. By afternoon, the vibrations got stronger. You could feel them through your feet, like something massive was moving underground. Charlie refused to go near certain spots, tucking his tail and backing away whining. Maria set up her equipment around the RV, taking readings. "These patterns," she said, frowning at her laptop. "They're not random. It's almost like they're searching for something." That evening, Lucas found something that changed everything. A cave painting hidden behind some fallen rocks. It showed stick figures, but not normal ones. These had long twisted limbs and were surrounded by wavy lines that looked like tunnel maps. "Look at the date carved here," Lucas said, pointing to some faded numbers. 1952. "That's when those miners disappeared, right, Dad?" I nodded, remembering the stories. 30 men had vanished in these mines, never found. The official report said it was a cave-in, but no bodies were ever recovered. As the sun set, the clicking sounds returned, louder this time. But now they had a purpose. They were moving in a circle around our RV, getting closer with each round. Charlie stood guard by the door, hackles raised, watching something we couldn't see. That's when Lucas made his decision. "I'm going to check it out," he whispered, grabbing his backpack. "Just a quick look. I'll be back in an hour." "Lucas, no." I grabbed his arm, but he pulled away. "Dad, we need to know what's down there. I'll be careful, I promise." Before I could stop him, he slipped out the door and disappeared into the darkness. That was the last time I saw my son as himself. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. 1 hour passed, then 2. No sign of Lucas. My heart was pounding as Maria and I searched around the mine entrance with our flashlights. Charlie kept sniffing the ground, whining and pulling us toward the dark opening of the mine. The clicking sounds were getting louder, almost like they were laughing at us. "Lucas," I shouted into the darkness. The echo of my voice bounced back, but something else came with it. A strange scraping sound, like metal being dragged across stone. That's when we found his phone, dropped near the entrance. The screen was cracked, but it was still recording. When we played back the video, my blood turned to ice. Lucas had filmed himself walking into the tunnel. At first, everything seemed normal, just the beam of his flashlight bouncing off old mining equipment. Then the camera started shaking. You could hear his breathing get faster. "Oh my God," Lucas's voice whispered on the recording. "There's something, Dad, you need to see this." The video showed glimpses of strange markings on the walls, glowing like Maria's rocks. Then came a series of rapid clicks, much closer than we'd heard before. The camera spun around and for a split second, we saw it, a pale twisted shape moving in the darkness. The video ended with Lucas's scream. "We need to go in after him," I said, checking my old mining lamp. Maria grabbed my arm. "Jack, wait. Look at this." She pointed her flashlight at the ground. The dirt around the entrance had strange marks, not footprints exactly, but long curved grooves, like something had been dragging itself along. Charlie started barking at the mine entrance, but he wouldn't go in. That's when we heard Lucas's voice echoing from deep inside the tunnel. "Dad, Dad, help." I started forward, but Maria pulled me back. "That's not right," she whispered. "The voice, it sounds wrong." She was right. It was Lucas's voice, but somehow hollow, like someone Bias or something Bias was trying to copy it. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the entrance. The clicking sounds surrounded us now, and I swear I could see shadows moving just at the edge of our flashlight beams. They were hurting us, I realized, trying to separate us just like they'd taken Lucas. We made it back to the RV, but we knew we couldn't stay there long. Whatever lived in these tunnels had my son, and they were letting us know they could take us too if they wanted. As we barricaded ourselves inside, Maria's laptop started beeping like crazy. The seismic readings were off the charts. Something big was moving under us, and it was moving fast. "Jack," Maria said, her voice shaking, "I don't think these are just tunnels. I think we've found their nest." That's when the ground started to shake, and we realized the true horror of what we were dealing with was about to reveal itself. The RV started shaking violently. Through the windows we watched in horror as the ground cracked open like a giant mouth. Charlie barked frantically and Maria clutched her research notes as we saw them emerge. They crawled out of the earth like nightmares come to life. Pale, twisted bodies that looked almost human, but wrong in every way. Their arms and legs were too long, bent at odd angles, and their skin was white as chalk. But their eyes glowed like the strange rocks we'd found, and they moved with an awful grace, like dancers underwater. "The missing miners," I whispered, remembering the disappearances from the 1950s. They changed. One of them stood taller than the rest, its body twisted around what looked like an old mining helmet fused to its shoulder. It raised its long, deformed hand and made those clicking sounds we'd been hearing, but now we could see how. Its fingers were like metal rods, tapping against each other in that horrible rhythm. "They're communicating," Maria said, her voice barely a whisper. "All those vibrations, the clicking, it's their language." Through the RV window I saw more of them emerging, surrounding us. They moved like they could bend their bodies any way they wanted, squeezing through spaces that should have been too small. Some of them still wore tattered remains of mining uniforms, Idaho tags dangling from their stretched necks. Then I saw something that made my heart stop. Behind them, being led like a child, was Lucas. He was walking strange, his movements jerky. When he turned toward the RV, I could see his skin had started to turn pale, and his fingers were longer than they should be. "Dad," his voice cracked, sounding half like himself and half like their clicking. "Dad, they want to show us something. They want us to join them." Charlie growled at the window, but even he seemed scared. These things weren't just monsters, they were what happened when people stayed too long in the deep dark of the mines. They had evolved, changed by whatever strange minerals lay buried in these mountains. The leader creature raised its arm, pointing at me with those metal-like fingers. In its twisted face, I saw something familiar, like it remembered being human once, long ago. "Jack." Maria grabbed my arm. "The minerals in my samples, they're changing, Lucas. That's how it happens. That's how they make new ones." We had to make a choice right then. Either we could try to run, though the creatures had us surrounded, or we could follow them down into their underground city to save my son. But looking at Lucas's half-changed face, I knew we were running out of time. The ground rumbled again, and more cracks appeared around the RV. They weren't just inviting us down there. They were going to take us, whether we wanted to go or not. I grabbed my old mining lamp and looked at Maria. "We're going after him." Charlie pressed against my leg, ready to follow despite his fear. As we stepped out of the RV, the creatures parted like a twisted honor guard, their clicking sounds echoing through the night air. They were welcoming us to their kingdom below, and I had a terrible feeling that getting in would be a lot easier than getting out. They led us down into the darkness. The tunnels weren't like any mines I'd worked in. These were smooth, almost polished, like the creatures had somehow melted the rock itself. Our flashlights showed glowing veins of that strange mineral running through the walls, pulsing like living things. Charlie stayed close, his fur brushing against my leg as we walked deeper. Maria kept her hand on my arm, whispering, "Jack, look at how they move the rock." She was right, the creatures were touching the walls, and the stone was actually shifting under their fingers, opening new passages. Lucas walked ahead of us with the leader creature. Every few minutes he turned to look at us, and each time his face had changed a bit more. His eyes were starting to glow, and his fingers were getting longer. He didn't seem scared anymore. More like he was in a trance. The deeper we go, the stronger they get. Maria said quietly, "They're connected to these minerals somehow. They're part of the mountain now." Suddenly, the tunnel opened into something that made us all freeze. It was a massive cave, bigger than a football field, lit by those glowing minerals. But what shocked us wasn't the size, it was what we saw inside. An underground city. Not just tunnels, but actual buildings carved from stone. And there were more creatures, dozens of them. Some looked fresher, more human-like, while others were so twisted they barely looked human at all. Among them, we saw people in modern clothes, half-changed like Lucas. "More victims," I whispered. "They've been taking people all along." The leader creature made a series of clicks, and Lucas turned to us. His voice was strange now. A mix of human speech and their clicking language. "Dad, they want to show us their secret, why they need us." That's when we heard it. A deep rumbling that shook the whole cave. But this wasn't like the earlier vibrations. This was something bigger, something ancient. "The mountain," Maria gasped. "It's not just a mountain, it's alive." The creatures all turned toward the sound, raising their twisted arms. Lucas joined them, his body starting to bend in ways it shouldn't. I knew we had minutes, maybe seconds, to save him before he became one of them completely. Charlie started pulling at my pant leg, urging me toward a darker tunnel on the far side of the cave. He could smell something mental or someone down there. Maybe others who had tried to escape. I had to make a choice, follow Charlie's lead or try to grab Lucas right now. But with dozens of creatures around us, and the whole mountain seeming to wake up, one wrong move could trap us down here forever. The clicking sounds got louder, more excited. The leader creature reached for Lucas, its metal-like fingers almost touching his face. We were out of time. What happened next would determine whether we'd ever see daylight again, or become part of the Hollow Mountain forever. I grabbed Maria's hand and made the split-second decision to follow Charlie. If he'd found something, it might be our only chance. We slipped away while the creatures were distracted by their ritual, my heart breaking as I heard Lucas's voice becoming more clicks than words. The narrow tunnel Charlie led us through was different. Rougher, like it was made by human tools, not the creature's powers. After a few minutes of crawling, we heard something that made us stop, human voices whispering. In a small cave, we found them, 3 people huddled around a battery-powered lantern. 2 men, and a woman, all wearing dirty hiking clothes. They jumped when they saw us, but relaxed when they noticed Charlie. "You're trying to save someone too, aren't you?" the woman asked. Her name was Beth, and they'd been hiding here for 2 days after the creatures took her son. The others were trying to find missing family members too. "They can't come in here," one of the men explained. "Something about these old tunnels blocks their power. The original miners must have found a way to protect themselves." Maria examined the walls, her eyes widening. "It's a different kind of rock here. It cancels out the effects of those glowing minerals. That's why they abandoned these passages." Suddenly, Charlie's ears perked up. The clicking sounds were getting closer. They'd noticed we were gone. "There's a way out," Beth whispered, "through the old ventilation shafts." "But," she hesitated, "we haven't left because of our loved ones. We can't just abandon them." I knew exactly how she felt. Lucas was still out there, turning into one of them. But now we had something the creatures didn't expect, knowledge of their weakness. I have an idea, I said, remembering my old mining days. But it's dangerous. If those old mining explosives are still down here, Maria caught on quickly. We could block their access to the mineral veins, cut off their power source. The clicking got louder, they were getting closer. Charlie growled at the tunnel entrance, and we could see shadows moving in the distance. We have to decide now, I said, looking at everyone's scared faces. Either we try to save them all, or we save ourselves. But whatever we do, we have to do it fast. The ground started shaking again, and dust fell from the ceiling. The mountain was waking up, and this time, it felt angry. We had minutes to make our choice, and one wrong move would trap us down here forever. I pulled out my old mining lamp, its beam cutting through the darkness. Who's with me? 5 pairs of determined eyes looked back at me. Whatever happened next would either be our salvation or our doom. But at least we wouldn't face it alone. The creature's clicks echoed through the tunnels, getting closer and closer. Time was running out. We split into 2 groups. Maria and Beth would lead the others to the ventilation shaft, while Charlie and I went to find the old explosive storage. The plan was simple but risky. We'd set charges where the glowing minerals were strongest, hopefully cutting off the creature's power source. I found the explosives right where I remembered, in a rusty locker marked Danger. My hands shook as I gathered what we needed. Charlie suddenly growled. The clicking sounds were getting closer. Through the tunnel, I heard Lucas's voice, more inhuman than ever. "Dad, why are you fighting this? The mountain, it's calling us." I pressed myself against the wall, holding Charlie close. Through a crack, I saw Lucas pass by. His body was barely human now. Fingers like metal rods, skin almost transparent. The sight broke my heart. My radio crackled. Maria's voice whispered through static. "Jack, we found all the others. 7 people total, all half changed. But they're fighting it when they're away from the minerals. There's still hope." That's when the leader creature appeared, its twisted body filling the tunnel. It reached out and touched the wall, and the rocks started to melt and move. They were searching every tunnel, and they were getting close. I had seconds to make a choice. The explosives were ready, but setting them off might bring the whole mountain down. Could I risk everyone's lives on this gamble? Charlie nudged my hand, whining softly. He looked at me with those trusting eyes, then at the tunnel where Lucas had gone. Even my dog knew we had to try. I pressed the radio button. "Maria, get everyone as high up as you can. When you hear the blast, run for the surface. Don't wait for us." "Jack, no. Just trust me." I took a deep breath and stepped out into the main tunnel, explosives in hand. The leader creature turned its glowing eyes toward me, and Lucas stood beside it, almost fully transformed. "You want to show me your secret?" I called out, my voice echoing. "Well, I've got a secret too. I know these mines better than you ever will." The creature tilted its head, clicking rapidly. More of them emerged from the shadows, surrounding me. But they didn't attack, they were curious. I held up the explosives. "You took my son. You took all these people. Now it's time to give them back." Lucas reached out with his twisted hand. "Dad, please, join us." I looked at my son's glowing eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, Lucas. Sometimes love means making hard choices." Then I threw the explosives into the largest mineral vein and hit the detonator. The mountain screamed. The explosion was deafening. The whole mountain shook like it was alive and in pain. The glowing minerals started cracking and going dark, like stars blinking out in the night sky. The creatures screamed, not clicks anymore, but human screams. They fell to the ground, their twisted bodies shaking. The leader creature reached for me, but its powers were failing. The rock stopped moving under its touch. "Lucas," I shouted, running toward my son as he collapsed. His body was changing again, but this time in reverse. The metal-like parts of him were softening, his fingers shrinking back to normal size. Charlie ran to him, licking his face as he groaned. "Dad?" His voice was his own again. "What? What happened?" But we didn't have time to talk. The tunnels were starting to cave in. "Can you run?" I asked, helping him up. He nodded weakly. We ran through the collapsing passages, Charlie leading the way. Behind us I could hear the creatures following, but they were slower now, more human. Without their powers, they were just lost souls in the dark. "Jack," Maria's voice echoed from above. "This way." We saw flashlight beams cutting through the dust. Maria and the others had found a stable path out. All around us, the changed people were turning back to normal, confused and scared but alive. The ground cracked beneath our feet as we climbed. My old mining instincts kicked in. I knew we had minutes before the whole place collapsed. I pushed Lucas ahead of me, making sure everyone else got out first. Just as I reached the surface, I heard one final scream from below. The leader creature still deep in the mountain. It was a human scream now, full of loss and sadness. Then the entrance collapsed, sealing the hollow mountain forever. We all stood there in the early morning light, covered in dust and shaking. Lucas hugged me tight, crying into my shoulder. He was completely himself again, no trace of the transformation left. Maria checked everyone over. All the taken people had returned to normal, though their eyes still held a haunted look that I knew would never quite go away. Charlie barked happily, wagging his tail as he watched the sunrise. Our old RV sat where we'd left it, somehow untouched by all the chaos. "Is it over?" Lucas asked quietly. I looked at the sealed mine entrance, then at the others we'd saved. "Yes, son. It's over. The mountain will keep its secrets now." As we drove away in the RV, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment I thought I saw a pale figure standing on the mountainside, its long fingers raised in farewell. Then it was gone, and the mountain was just a mountain again. But sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear those clicking sounds in my dreams, and I know that deep underground, in the darkness of the hollow mountain, something is still waiting, still changing, still calling out to those who would listen. Lucas never went cave exploring again. Can't say I blame him. Some places in this world are better left undisturbed, and some mysteries are better left buried deep in the dark where they belong.